All right, everyone, this is going to be an introductory lecture for biological anthropology. For those of you who have never taken an anthropology class before, we're going to do a quick overview of what anthropology is, just to kind of familiarize with everyone with what the field is and what people study in the field. And then after we do that, we will move more into detail about biological anthropology specifically and what we'll be talking about in class this semester. Okay, so the question on the slide here is, what is anthropology? And as it answers at the bottom of the screen, it is the study of humankind. Obviously, this is a pretty wide-ranging field. Any number of things having to do with studying human biology, behavior, history can fall under this broad umbrella. So because of that reason, anthropology is considered to be a holistic field of study, meaning that it incorporates lots and lots of different types of approaches and kind of theoretical underpinnings and goals. It has 4 fields, and you can see here on the slide what those fields are. We have cultural, linguistic, archaeology, and physical or biological anthropology. Now, sometimes you might see the term physical anthropology. That term is basically interchangeable with biological anthropology, but we have moved as a field more into a place of using the term biological anthropology more so than physical. So physical is still used sometimes, but it's a little out of date. Okay, so what exactly is cultural anthropology? I would be willing to bet that if some of you have taken anthropology classes, what you took was probably a cultural anthropology class. Cultural anthropology is the study of humankind. So this is really from a cultural standpoint. I have a definition of culture here at the bottom of the screen, which is the sum total of learned traditions, values, and beliefs that groups of people and a few highly intelligent species of animals possess. So we're not really going to be talking about a lot of cultural subjects in this class. We will actually be discussing the second part of that definition, some highly intelligent species of animals. Towards the middle of the semester, we're going to talk a little bit about primate behavior and especially ape behavior and how some aspects of primate behavior can count as cultural behavior. But beyond that, if we were to study cultural anthropology, we would study the societies, basically, as it says in the slide, in a cross-cultural context. So we could be looking at anything: language, religion, dress, food, essentially anything, any kind of behavior that's shaped by culture. So cultural anthropologists try to bring understanding of another culture by comparing it to the culture of the investigator. And this is kind of what this cross-cultural context means. So we basically can't study a culture in a vacuum. We can't travel to Indonesia and observe aspects of Indonesian behavior without it being filtered through our own understanding. So we're always going to be viewing and interpreting other cultures through the lens of our own. So that's something that's really important to keep in mind. So as a research strategy, cultural anthropologists use something called participant observation. This just means that the individual who is studying, the cultural anthropologist who is studying the group in question, will take part in that culture to some degree. So they'll try to kind of immerse themselves in that culture and understand it as much as possible from the inside. The next type of anthropology, subfield of anthropology that we'll talk about, is archaeology. A lot of people are probably most familiar with archaeology from the Indiana Jones series. Really not a very accurate portrayal of archaeology, but at least it gives people an idea of kind of what archaeologists are trying to do. So archaeologists study the material culture of past peoples. So material culture is basically any kind of object or artifact from a past human society. So it's all of the physical objects that are left behind after a people disappear for whatever reason. So the artifacts that are left behind could be anything from tools to art. It could be remnants of fire pits, for example. It's very, very broad. So archaeologists are essentially trying to explore the same questions that cultural anthropologists are trying to explore, but they don't have the living people to observe for their research. They're just looking at what was left behind. So archaeologists can be interested in things like warfare, agriculture, lifeways in general, and the factors behind the rise and fall of civilizations. Archaeologists do field research. As you can see, they dig extensively at field sites in various types of circumstances. You can see a picture on the slide showing what one of these digs looks like. And here's another picture. It is a very dirty job. Can be physically demanding, but is also quite interesting. The third is linguistics. So linguistic anthropology is the study of language, its origin, and its use. So this is also a pretty broad-ranging area within anthropology. Language is perhaps the only uniquely human social behavior, but even that is debatable because there's lots of strong evidence supporting the fact that great apes, including chimps and gorillas, have some capacity for rudimentary language. There have been lots of different cases where chimps and gorillas have been taught to use forms of sign language, for example. So we'll talk a lot more about that in maybe 6 weeks when we get to that section of the course. But for the most part, apes, including chimps and gorillas, are quite limited in their language capacity compared to humans. So humans, really, our entire perception of the world around us is filtered through the use of language. So that is something that we will talk a little bit. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit by the end of the semester. We'll talk about the origins of language. But linguistic anthropologists as a field really like to study the role that language plays in shaping culture. Okay, so that brings us to biological anthropology. So biological anthropology is the fourth of these 4 separate subfields that we've been talking about. So the rest of this slide set is going to be about different types of biological anthropology. So there's a lot of different things that a biological anthropologist can study, and we'll do a quick overview of what some of those things are. Okay, so biological anthropology is the study of humans as biological organisms considered in an evolutionary framework. So this is quite different from the other 3 subfields that we've talked about in both focus and in approach. Research is based in more of an empirical kind of concept than anything else. It's less about observing and interpreting behavior. It's more about following the scientific method and using those guidelines for engaging in research. Okay, so it's a pretty wide-ranging field, as I said. Everything from primatology, which is studying primate evolution and primate behavior, to forensic anthropology, and lots of things in between. And there's also a lot of overlap in some of those categories. So we'll go through some of these categories within biological anthropology so that we can get an idea of what some of the things are that we'll be studying in this course throughout the semester. Okay, so primatology is the study of non-human primates and their anatomy, genetics, behavior, and ecology. So a lot of what primatologists do is very similar to what zoologists do. Really, the only reason that primatologists are included under the umbrella of biological anthropology is because primates are our closest living relatives. So for historical reasons, primatologists don't really exist in a zoology department in most universities. They're usually umbrellaed in with biological anthropology. So why? Why is this the case? Well, as I said, primates are our closest living relatives, the apes especially. The picture on your left is a picture of an orangutan, of course. An orangutan is a relatively close relative to humans. We'll talk later in the class about how closely related we are. And then over on the right, you have a lemur. So lemurs are pretty distinctly different from orangutans, as you can imagine, but they are both primates and they share a lot of characteristics in terms of their appearance, their anatomy, and their behavior as a result. So primatologists tend to study non-human primates as a means of understanding our own evolution. So if we can look at the cognitive differences between a lemur and a chimpanzee, for example, it can tell us a little bit about our own evolution and how the trajectory of our cognition has kind of progressed over the millennia. Okay, so moving on to human variation. Biological anthropologists today look at human variation in terms of possible adaptive significance. So the term adaptive significance is one that we're going to be using a lot in this semester. Basically, what we mean when we say adaptive significance is what role could these forms of variation have played in evolution in the past. So the picture here is showing the world's tallest man and the world's shortest man. The world's tallest man is 7'9", and the world's shortest man is a mere 29 inches. Now, if we were archaeologists digging up skeletons 500 years from now, and we came across these two individual skeletons, we might be really confused about why these individuals are so different in size for being members of the same species. So studying human variation is really important because it gives us an idea of how wide-ranging our physical characteristics can be across the globe. Now, a lot of human variation studies today look at health-related questions. So, possible adaptations to environmental stress that might impact health. We will talk later a lot about that. I think it's in chapter 5 that we'll get to that. So we'll talk about skin color. We know that ranges of skin color in modern human populations are a direct result of evolutionary history. We understand the mechanism that produced it. It's a very kind of well understood part of modern human variation. So we'll talk a lot about that in about a month. Somewhat related to that is human biology. As it says here, human biology is an interdisciplinary field that examines human biological variation in evolutionary, social, historical, and environmental contexts. So we're looking again at this human biological variation, but a lot of the studies in human biology, again, have this really intensive focus on questions of health, like maybe why do we see higher rates of iron deficiency anemia in some groups than others. So it really is encompassing a lot of different aspects of other scientific fields. So I've known several human biology professors at other universities who have close ties with nutrition department or public health department, for example. So a lot of their research is focused on living populations, the biology of living populations, and how to improve health and access to medical resources and things like that across the world. Next, we have human skeletal biology and human osteology. This is simply studying the anatomy of the skeleton. So looking at how humans grow physiologically through growth and development from the embryo up through adulthood. So looking at anatomy, but also understanding physiology and development and aspects of human growth as well. One thing that is really important in human osteology and how it's applied in real-world situations, which we'll get to in a second, is something called the biological profile. So the biological profile is a set of characteristics that, with a little bit of training, you can determine from looking at a set of skeletal remains. So if you are trained properly, you can look at a set of skeletal remains and you can determine the age at death, the sex, the biological sex, male or female, ancestry, and stature. So this is something that is especially important in forensic anthropology, which we'll briefly talk about in just a second. But you can imagine if, the police discover a set of remains, it's going to be really important to them to be able to figure out what those characteristics are so that they can help to identify the set of remains. So an example of this, you can see here on the screen, this is a dental development chart. So if the set of remains that's discovered somewhere happens to be subadult, meaning a child, you can look at dental development and get a pretty clear idea of how old the individual was at death. So you can see here on the slide, starting with this, where I have the cursor here, this is what the dentition of a 7-year-old looks like inside of their gum line. So we have the teeth on the bottom here. The blue teeth are baby teeth, deciduous teeth. The yellow teeth are adult dentition. So looking at a chart like that, if we compare what we see in this chart to a set of human remains, subadult human remains or child remains, we can really narrow down easily how old the child is based on how their dentition is mixed. What teeth have emerged that are adult teeth versus baby teeth. In the same vein, as I said before, we can also determine biological sex, so male versus female. Just a quick note, when we talk about biological sex, we are talking about sex as determined by chromosomes. So XX or XY, biological male or biological female. We are not talking about gender. Gender is kind of a different concept. It's more culturally influenced. There's a lot of self-definition that goes in there. So when we're talking about this, we're just talking about biological male and biological female. Now, these are, we won't go into a lot of detail about this, but these are basically areas of the skull that are indicative of male versus female. So the general trend is that these items on the skull that are being indicated with the arrows are larger and heavier in males than they are in females. So this last one here, the mental eminence, that's just a fancy way of saying chin. We can look at the scale here for reference. So if we have a skull that we're trying to look at and we're trying to determine whether it's male or female, if we look at the shape of the chin, we can compare it to this little scale here from 1 to 5 and see what it most closely resembles. If it looks a lot like number 1, it's most likely a female. If it looks a lot like number 5, it's most likely a male. And then you can do that with any of these characteristics here. Paleopathology, if we break down this term, paleo means ancient and pathology means disease. So the study of disease in ancient populations. This is important a lot. It's used in conjunction with archaeology to a great degree. Basically, it's looking at the health of ancient populations. So if an archaeologist discovers a cemetery, for example, a biological anthropologist can come in, they can examine the skeletons, they can look at disease markers, they can look at average age at death, for example, and they can tell a lot about the overall health of a population. So they can look at signs of trauma. Do a lot of these individuals have broken bones? They can look for nutritional deficiencies, and they can look for evidence of infectious disease. So the picture on the slide is a skull of an individual that has advanced syphilis. So prior to the invention or the discovery of antibiotics, syphilis was untreatable for the most part. It was uncurable. There were some kind of not very effective treatments, but it was uncurable. If a person has syphilis and it goes untreated and they never receive antibiotics, eventually this is what their skull looks like. So you see these lesions all over the outer surface of the skull, and in the back here, the skull has dissolved completely away. So if we find something like this in the archaeological record, we know that these individuals had, possibly an epidemic of syphilis that they were dealing with. In terms of other health questions, as I said before, you can look for signs of nutritional deficiencies. This is an example of something that's really common in archaeological populations. What we're looking at here is this kind of porous appearance to the upper margin of the eye socket here. That is very typical of an individual who has suffered from severe iron deficiency anemia for a long period of time. So a lot of women in Western society are mildly anemic as a result of menstruation. This is not really something that you're going to find with mild cases of anemia. This is indicative of really long-term chronic severe anemia. But again, you see these things in archaeological populations, and you can make inferences about the overall health of that population. So that brings us to forensic anthropology. Forensic anthropology, as it says here, is the application of biological anthropology in a medico-legal context. So all of the things that we've been talking about, looking at studying age at death, studying health of populations, we can add in trauma, do skulls or, bones have evidence of gunshot wounds, all of those pieces of information in a legal context. So looking at individual cases, if again, going back to the example of the police approaching a biological anthropologist and saying, oh, we found this set of remains out in the woods. Can you look at them? Can you determine age, sex, stature, all of that kind of stuff? Forensic anthropologists are also involved in investigations of mass fatalities. So things like plane crashes, forensic anthropologists were involved in the 9/11 investigations, collecting and analyzing remains for those issues, and also mass graves due to genocides and human rights violations. So in most cases, one of the primary goals of forensic anthropology is to establish a positive ID for the individual. So helping the police narrow down lists of missing persons, for example, by providing that biological profile information. Secondary to that, learning cause and manner of death. So, again, what we're looking at here is an example of gunshot wounds to a skull. So if we see gunshot wounds to a skull, we can report that to the police, and we can help them determine what cause and manner of death were. Paleoanthropology. Okay, so paleoanthropology is actually what I study. This is my field. This is what we're going to be talking about for about the last third of the semester. So Unit 3 in November and the beginning of December, we're going to be talking about paleoanthropology. So paleoanthropology is the study of the fossil record of ancestral humans and their primate kin. This picture on the slide is of a fossil that dates to around 2 million years ago. It's from East Africa. This is a species of human ancestor, or human relative rather, that we will discuss in a lot of detail later in the semester. So again, paleoanthropologists are studying the fossil record of ancestral humans and some primates. Human paleontology is really like a study of the anatomy of humans and hominins. So if we look at this skull here, why did these individuals have such heavy brow ridges? So it's really more anatomically kind of focused. The other is Paleolithic archaeology, so studying the material culture left behind, so early stone tool users, for example, or early art objects like the cave paintings of Lascaux. So it could be focused on anatomy, or it could be focused more on the archaeology, but it all kind of falls into this broad category of paleoanthropology. Okay, so that brings us to, I wanted to do just a brief overview of human evolution. We're going to go into a lot more detail about it later, but just so that you can get a broad understanding of the timing and tempo of human evolution. So we know that primates emerge in the fossil record, including ancestors of humans, of monkeys, of apes, other apes, of lemurs, etc., etc. Those very earliest primates appear in the fossil record about 60 million years ago. Jumping forward to 25 million years ago, we have the emergence of apes. Jumping forward to 18 or million, excuse me, not thousand. Jumping forward to 18 million years ago, we have the emergence of great apes, such as chimpanzees and gorillas. Jumping forward again, we have members of our own tribe, the hominins. So that happens 5 to 7 million years ago. Our genus Homo, emerges about 2 million years ago, and anatomically modern humans emerge about 190,000 years ago. The last item I have here is not really a biological transition, but it is a significant cultural transition. So about 10,000 years ago, we really changed the face of our species by inventing agriculture. So learning how to domesticate plants and animals and to grow food for ourselves rather than having to be constantly traveling around as foraging populations, finding food that exists in nature. We learned how to develop methods to grow food that produces a lot of fruit, for example, domesticate animals that have desirable characteristics. All of that began happening around 10,000 years ago. We'll talk a lot later about why it happened, but there does seem to have been a pretty significant shift in climate around 10,000 that allowed for agriculture to emerge. Now, I mentioned the term domestication. Domestication just means that you take a plant that exists in the wild and you begin selectively breeding it for characteristics that you think are beneficial. So the example that I like to use is the one on the slide here. Brassica, the Brassica genus, is a common wild mustard plant. It exists in a lot of different places. If you saw it, if you were out hiking and you saw a common wild mustard plant, you would just think it looked like a weed. It wouldn't necessarily look like anything that you could eat and get a lot of nutrition from. Now, over the ages, the common wild mustard plant has been selectively bred to produce a lot of the things that you see in the grocery store. So if we take a common wild mustard plant and we find some that have slightly larger leaves than the others, and we decide we want to plant more of those seed, try to come up with a new line of plants that all have large leaves, eventually what you'll end up with is kale. If you did the same for larger stems and flowers of that plant, you would end up with broccoli. For flower clusters, you would end up with cauliflower, and so on and so forth. So all of those things that you see here, including Brussels sprouts, cabbage, and kohlrabi, those are all the same species of plant. They've just been tinkered with very slightly to produce different characteristics. And that's essentially what domestication is. The example that is probably easiest to understand for everyone is the domestication of dogs from wild wolves. Wild wolves are very aggressive. They're very difficult animals for humans to be around. They're very dangerous. At some point in human history, probably as you know, far back in time as 25,000 years ago, humans started domesticating wolves. So they started spending more time around wolves and choosing to breed the wolves that were slightly less aggressive. So over thousands and thousands of years, if you're selecting for behavior that is less aggressive in a wolf, you'll eventually end up with a breed that is friendly and easy for humans to be around. And that's basically what happened with common domesticated dogs. Of course, with dogs, there was a lot of other domestication that took place, eventually leading to breeds, dog breeds. So a dog breeder is basically doing this process of domestication in real time. So they're breeding, animals that are really good at herding sheep, for example. They're picking the dogs in the litter that are the best at herding sheep, and they're choosing to breed those dogs because it keeps those characteristics present in the population. Okay, so as I mentioned before, research in biological anthropology is determined by the scientific method. So this is considered to be an empirical approach. Hopefully all of you have heard of biological anthropology. have heard of the scientific method probably from high school, but it involves, of course, these steps that you go through, including observation, developing hypotheses, testing those hypotheses, and drawing conclusions based on the data. And then in an academic setting, of course, publishing your findings is always important. The reason why publishing findings is important is so that your results can be retested by other scientists. So it's really a way of ensuring the quality of an individual's work, making sure that they are doing work that is well-designed, experiments that are well-designed, and that their findings are supported by the evidence. The last thing that I want to talk about here is the difference between these terms that you see here on the slide. So what's the difference between a hypothesis, a theory, and a law in science? So you've probably heard the term theory thrown around, just basically kind of meaning, oh, it's a wild guess, or it's an unproven idea that lacks credibility. Like, I have a theory, that the earth is flat, or something ridiculous like that. Just some crazy idea that has absolutely no scientific merit or basis. That is how the term theory is used colloquially by lay people. In science, theories are a little bit different. So the term theory means something very different in science than it does outside of the scientific field. So I want to go over what each of these terms mean so that we're clear on what the term theory means. So hypothesis, the first term here, is just any kind of proposed explanation for an observable phenomena. So you see something happening and you say, well, I'm going to make an educated guess as to why this is happening. I've observed this process happening multiple times. I'm going to come up with a possible rational explanation for why the phenomenon is happening. At that point, of course, if we're following the scientific method, to go back here, we have our observations, we develop a hypothesis, and then we have to test that hypothesis. So it's not enough to just say, I've come up with a possible explanation for X, Y, Z. You have to come up with a way of testing whether your hypothesis is correct or not through experimentation. So if you develop your hypothesis and you test that hypothesis through experimentation, and the experiments support your hypothesis, well then, of course, we can draw conclusions based on that supported hypothesis. Now, a theory, if we're talking about the term theory, a theory is basically what that hypothesis becomes if it's been tested and retested and it's never been disproven or falsified. So if you're doing good science, what you should be doing is that you should be trying to come up with experiments to test your hypothesis to refute your own hypothesis. So the goal should be to prove yourself wrong. You should try as hard as you can, do everything that you can come up with to try to disprove your own hypothesis. If you can't disprove your hypothesis, and nobody else can either, that's when it rises to the level of a scientific theory. So a scientific theory summarizes hypotheses that have been supported by multiple lines of independent testing. So a theory is considered valid when there's basically no evidence to dispute it. So I want you to understand how a scientific theory is very different than how the term is used by the lay public. So when we hear the statement evolution is just a theory, quote unquote, what that indicates is that the person who's saying that doesn't really understand the scientific process. They don't really understand the scientific method, and they don't understand the definition of the term theory. So when we say evolution is a theory, the theory of evolution, Darwin's theory of natural selection, what that means is that everybody since Darwin lived in the mid-19th century has attempted to disprove his theory and has not been able to. So in a scientific context, again, this means that evolution is supported by countless independent tests and that there's no evidence to dispute it. So there's no valid evidence coming from any of these experiments that has disputed Darwin's theory. The last item here, a law in science, is a fundamental principle in science. So it's not quite the same thing as a theory. A law basically, what it means is that it has to apply under the same conditions and implies a causal relationship between events. So it's not really an explanation of why things are the way they are. It's just an expression of the results of repeated observations. So Newton's law of universal gravitation, for example, if we hold a pencil up in the air and let go of it, it's always going to fall to the ground unless, wind is blowing it or something like that. If the conditions are the same, it's always going to fall to the ground every single time. So that is expressed in this law of universal gravitation, but it's not an attempt to explain why. So that is the important distinction between those three terms. So maybe this is review to everyone, but it's really important. As I said, the phrase "evolution is just a theory" is kind of a mistaken statement, indicating that the speaker does not necessarily understand what the concept of a theory is. Okay, so we're going to cut it off here. Everyone, please make sure that you have read through Chapter 1 in your textbook, and there will be an inquisitive quiz for Chapter 1 as well. But as I discussed in the intro, we're not going to be, those inquisitive scores are not due in until the week of the first exam.